Well, good afternoon and welcome to the June 17th edition of Inside Redesign. And as always, our guest, not always our guest, but our guest today is Mr. Josh Swartz from Chaparral School District. And as always, our host, Dr. Steve Wyckoff, is with us. So once again, we're anxious to hear about all the interesting redesign thoughts and actions that are going on in Chaparral. So with that, Dr. Wyckoff, I'll let you fire away with the first question for Josh.
So
you.
Josh, the first thing that we want to talk about, a little bit of background at Chaparral. Give us kind of your redesign history.
Okay. Hey, first of all, thanks for having me. And again, this is just one story of many that go along the redesign path, and do the best I can to remember what our journey has been like the last couple of years. So our redesign story started, we had applied to be an initial Mercury district several years ago. That's more than 2 or 3 at this point. So, and at that point had not been selected. Had also, before that even, had been invited to it was more of a roundtable group that worked through redesign conversations after the initial research done by Dr. Watson. And if I remember, Kevin Case was at Inman at the current time, and Kevin had invited me to be a part of the group. And it included personnel from across the state, it seemed like. And we were just going through what would redesign look like, what kind of, I think at that point, we're just trying to figure out what are some of the ideas out there and what might stick. And so after that initial conversation or some of that work, we had a chance to take some different teachers we had gone to Kansas City to check out, I'm trying to think, is it Epic? It's in Kansas City. Had gone to the Erie School District to check out their project-based learning. And even part of that committee that I was on included a couple educators from Erie, from the original, when that program had started. Mike Carson, I remember, was a part of that, and had a lot of good conversations just about how that worked and what was beneficial, what wasn't. If we were to do the same thing, what would we do different, similar, those kind of things. And so we had taken a group of parents and teachers on these learning tours, board members at that point even, and had somewhat started our own redesign before it was officially redesigned. We felt like at that point, and just because we knew we needed to do something different. The idea of improving post-secondary success had stuck, and it made sense. And probably to the conversations even at ESDAC with Mike and Steve, just leading superintendents through that conversation. So we had some energy to try something different and see what we could do. So we had come up with the idea originally of a student, this is secondary, from the secondary end, a student choice model where student could choose traditional, or a student could choose project-based learning, or a student could choose virtual. Kind of worked through that idea and proposed it, and it started several years ago. And I think the year it started was the same year the redesign Mercury application process began. And so by the time we had gone through a year of our own, that 3-choice model, we weren't selected for the Mercury project, but had been part of Gemini 2 and had gone through or Gemini 1, had gone through some workshops, things with Gemini 1 process with KSDE, and continue to work on the choice, the 3 choices. And by the time, I think we are now in year 3, finished up year 3 of the project-based academy. And virtual was a little new. We had always had credit recovery, or a way for kids to take online classes that were there, but probably not with the same exact flavor to it. But a few tweaks that we'd made to it. We really had left math out of our project-based learning. We'd also left out of the virtual classes that they could get some other way. If it was already in our curriculum lineup with the teacher, we would direct the kid to take it through that method. And then the virtual became more extensions of classes that we couldn't offer particularly, which is that's kind of similar across other buildings that are doing the same thing with online, which also picked up. And we also at the same time had started a program with Attica that was related to probably the just job and internship, just a post-secondary success rate on the certifications was kind of driving that work. And that started, I think, based on that same concept of post-secondary success, knowing that we weren't really helping kids talk through career options or what worked or what didn't. And so on that idea of things, we ended up hiring a director between the two districts, and that program has taken off as well. And it's kind of merged a bit because that person helps with our WSU tech classes and online learning and trying to find as many partnerships that are out there in our community, but it also ties well with project-based learning. And a lot of those things overlap a bit where we've learned that, that there's a lot of connection between those two programs. So, but that's kind of our general story of where it started and kind of where we're at with it. I think as we move forward, we're still trying to improve and really try to find out how successful is the program and what works, what doesn't, always kind of tweaking things as we go through. Now, that program started, but about the same time, from a district-wide standpoint, we were also working through with our Gemini 1 committee, as we applied for the KSDE program, trying to help bring our elementaries into the mix a bit and really focus on the four constructs or the four essentials of the redesign principles. And as we worked through and talked, we had a lot of great ideas, great conversation going on with our teaching group that was doing this. We got to the end of the year, halfway through the year, and really struggled knowing how to select what to work on, that process to help us decide. And that's when you come across a product through an architect who had shared. Another conversation group I was having was with a consultant out of Montana and an architect just on school redesign itself. And that led me to this Innovate K-12 concept, which is crowdsourcing platform that's web-based, where ideas get plugged in, people vote on it, and all of a sudden through a web-based it's almost a social media platform, you can start to see ideas that take off and which ones grow and which ones don't, which is, from a tech side of things, social media gets a little scary because you don't have as much control over it, right? You get something out wide open, it's very different than if you have a controlled setting in a room. And so once you open the door to anything web-based, it opens up the conversation to broader, just a little scarier at times. But so after that, we had somewhat kept our other two programs going, but wanted to learn, kind of shifted our focus to innovation. How do we continue to innovate and redesign, knowing that it's not a one-time event? You know, redesign is not a one-time thing. You've always got to consistently look at what needs to be adjusted, and how do you do that in a way that really challenges where we want to go with something. So, but the Innovate K-12 process is really based on collecting ideas, voting on those, and then selecting ideas that would go to a design workshop where you kind of go through, hey, we're going to build this idea around the group that's going to use it, really using the kind of empathy, and then build to prototypes and the how might we questions and that process itself. And so we had a couple ideas. So this is 2 years ago that process began, and had a couple ideas that came out of that merged into an after-school program. And we also started a program that was for our seniors, kind of the last couple weeks of school during seminar, learning how to interview, just going through some, I would say, their life skill kind of things. If you're going to be successful in the workplace, here are some basic things you need to do. So that idea came out of it. So we learned that it was sometimes innovation it's an idea that gets started, and sometimes they stick, sometimes they don't. It was the philosophy we took on. It's always lined up with our district goals and what kind of things that we sense from our community. But some ideas that are there really take off and some don't. But I think that's where we've learned our innovation definition is really based on quite a few different things besides just that single event, but it's about improvement and challenging the status quo a bit. So anyway, that's kind of a long spiel, but that's kind of where we've gone so far.
Josh, you and I visited last week, and you talked about that. You really wanted to move everybody more than what the process at KSDE was moving everyone. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, they didn't quite match up the same exact way. So we had selected the Innovate K-12 during that year when we were Gemini 1, and there were Zoom conversations that we would listen in on the Mercury group's work. There wasn't a lot of coaching going on with our Gemini 1 piece. And then year 2 of Gemini is when the formal process began. And then at that point, we've already selected our Innovate K-12. And the KSDE process was it was built on, consensus from your building, build the goals first, and then you redesign around what goals you want to go to. And ours was just based on the ideas. We were just collecting ideas that people had, and people would vote on those. And most of the time when people vote, they're going to vote on something that they think is important. That was kind of how we framed that. So in the roundabout sense, we were still gathering consensus from people because the voting process did that. It just didn't match up. It didn't match up the same way. And so we ended up stepping away from the KSDE process eventually. We ended up, we still did our presentations, but we somewhat worked on our own until that presentation time in May of that year for us is Gemini 2 year, I guess is what it would have been. It might have been was that the 18-19 school year? I think is what it was.
Mm-hmm. I think so.
Yeah. So yeah, a little bit different. I think the concept by the end, it was all very similar, but how that path to get there was different.
Yeah.
It was just different.
Well, and we've all heard Dr. Watson talk many times about, I don't care what process you use to redesign, just redesign.
Yeah.
So, you're perfectly aligned with what he talked about. The question I have is when everybody in your district could suggest innovations. Is that correct?
Right. Yeah.
How did you kind of guide that? Did you just say, what innovative things do you think we should try? Or did you kind of finish that sentence with, what kind of things do you think we ought to try in order to help every child succeed?
Mm-hmm. I think that first year it was a pretty wide open question. And we had coaching from the Innovate K-12 group. It's pretty strong on coaching us through a process. The district that had done that in Minnesota had done it for several years. And so selecting your question is pretty crucial with anything, right? Like research is a research question. It's what you're shooting for.
Yeah.
And so that first year was pretty much what ideas do you have to help our students be successful? That was a broad question along those lines. But anybody can enter. I think we worked on, here's how we staged that. When we first started talking about this, that 18-19 year, we knew we needed to get community to have enough courage, people to have enough courage to put ideas in. That's the hardest part sometimes, just get it started. How do you get it started? So we had building leadership teams working on this because through that was part of the KSDE process, was put your building leadership team together. And we had kind of been really focusing on that leadership group more than anything. And we had scheduled a community meeting in August before we did our first event. And each leadership team person was going to be in charge of their own, picture a table in our lunchroom. So each leadership team person was to go invite and create their membership of 8 to 10 people, their own cohort. That's what it was. So each person, we went through and we had a list of names. Reminds me of network marketing days where you come down, you put all your list of names down on a piece of paper. We shared the list just to make sure we weren't duplicating names, because we would run into trouble if, one teacher A called the same person, teacher B and C. So we wanted to make sure we had enough names down there to get 8 to 8. It was about 8 people per table is what we were shooting for. And we had, I think, we got 3 buildings, 6 members on each team, 18 people, and we had over 100 people show up for that event. And we had worked through 3 or 4 questions. For one of them was, and each group kind of worked through a different question. And we had a big Google PowerPoint that we typed responses on so everybody could see the responses. And one of them was, where's Harper County going to go in 20 years? Where had they come from? Where are we at currently? So it was kind of the past, present, and future kind of thought. And we use that then to stage, all right, so based on these conversations of what you've seen, what kind of ideas are out there to help us be at our best or help us with student success. So we left that evening meeting with a template questionnaire on jot down some key ideas and be waiting for in a couple of weeks. We're going to start this innovation event where we want you to type some ideas into this thing. So after that event, we had collected some of the ideas ourselves, because part of it is when you start the event, you want to plant some ideas in the system. You don't want it when somebody gets out onto it, you want to make sure a group has already planted some ideas. So it's not you got to see something first, right? If it's already rolling, it's a lot easier to put an idea in. So we had collected some from that standpoint. And then I think that first year we collected about 33 different ideas with the whole thing. That was just teachers. It was just a teacher piece. Parents and the community had helped kind of frame some of the questions and the concerns or whatever it might be to help put the ideas in, but it was more just teachers that put the ideas in. And so that first year was, there was a lot of excitement and energy around it, because we finally felt like, hey, we had a way to move on some of the ideas that we had. So that was how we got, it was really based, a lot of coaching took place. And we even had we had a coaching team and an encouragement team. You know, you want to make sure you're reaching out to people. Hey, keep checking this, just keep the conversation going. And it takes an intentional effort to keep people talking about it. A lot of relationship based one-on-one. We've used the philosophy that if you're going to get people at an event, a personal invite's the way to go. You always mass invite, but a personal invite is a lot more effective to get people to participate.
Yeah. Josh, quick question. When you started phrasing the question to your communities, your various stakeholders, and you talked about student success, did you intentionally define it by the 4 ways we measure success in schools?
Clarify a little bit what you mean by that.
Well, get an industry certification while you're in high school, industry certification after you graduate, a post-secondary degree, or in progress in post-secondary. The 4 official that are on the effective.
No, we had talked about it. We had not focused on that specific data from that standpoint at that point. I think we had used just a general definition of student success from a standpoint of find something that you can do after high school, be productive that way. Pretty general term from that standpoint, not necessarily
more of a generic definition.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
And how many ideas did you say you generated the first year?
33.
33. Were they pretty well spread K through 12? Or
They were. And I'm trying to, some were, we even had some that were capital related kind of projects. Because at that first year, we were just collecting everything, trying to make sure we had enough most of the first goal is participation with it. So we had, once we got through that first cycle, we started to classify some as, they were capital projects. That just requires money and justification, those kind of things. So they kind of got we sorted those out, I guess, a bit. But so 33 that first year. Pretty widespread, though, elementary, secondary.
How then did you go about narrowing down and saying, this is or these are the projects we're going to work on?
Yeah, first year, we just went strictly off the voting. And we said we were going to, whenever you put an idea in, you say it's either a big, a medium, or a little idea. So so a person puts the idea in. This is where it gets rather tricky, because a big idea to one person's a medium or a little to somebody else. And so we said, hey, we'll select 1 big idea, 2 mediums, and 3 smalls. So we had 6 ideas that were going to go past that first round of the workshops. And we had just used that first year, just the voting criteria, just the votes. Whichever ones had the most votes that were the big idea, it was the winner. It was strictly off that. And I'm trying to think that first year, I think it might have been I can't even remember what it was. I have to look some of those up. We learned for the second year that strategy doesn't work best. I know one of them that we selected was more on, we just needed to find a kind of a community help email list. If a kiddo needs a bed at home, or closed or something, how do we reach out to our community to put together just a list?
Yeah.
A list of names. Well, from a design standpoint, that idea really doesn't need a ton of prototyping, because it's just, you're going to do it, you move on down the road with it. It's not really a design kind of project with it. So year 2, we really had a committee. Once we got our voting done, we sat down with a group of 6 teachers that were part of our design coaches and some other people part of that, to say, all right, which ideas that they might be highly voted on, but which ones really fit a design workshop the best? Because part of the process is you pull a group of whoever. Another key thing to remember, whoever's voting thing wins, they're the champion for that idea. So their next piece of this is to recruit a team that's going to be on their design team. So we learned after year 1, we need to check with this team person, this idea person, do they even want to be the champion for this? And if they put the idea in hoping somebody else might step in and take over for them, well, we need to go find somebody else then. Without the champion, the idea doesn't move.
Yeah.
And so some of these ideas we kind of talked through, going, well, this person's pretty excited about it. I bet it has enough energy to keep going. So we selected it. So we kind of went and we looked at kind of elementary, secondary, made sure we had one from each level, and a community idea that was there. So we got a little more strategic with it year 2 compared to year 1.
No, Josh, we have found, we call them a committed project lead.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't care how good the idea is. If you don't have a committed project lead, it'll fail.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
We have found the same thing the hard way.
Mm-hmm. And and you got to be comfortable with an idea not moving on. This might have been the best, the winning idea across the whole district. Some idea gets tossed out there, but again, if you don't have the champion or the lead of it, then it's going to have to be passed on. So
when you had that situation, if somebody says, but God, this is a great idea, do you say, do you want to be the champion of this?
Yes, that's what you start working on. I mean, if it's so great, okay, let's talk about if it's a great idea, then we've got, hopefully somebody else out there sees it the same way and would want to lead this. And the other key piece when we talk about championing or leading, key thing to say is to the person that's the champion, you won't do this alone. You're not in this by yourself.
Yeah.
So you've got people walking alongside, but at the same time, we do need you to keep your team moving. Your main role is to keep your team excited about this thing.
Yeah. So Josh, what are some of the ideas then that you did have the champion for and that you've started to do?
All right, so I got to go to my notes. This is where I got to go to my cheat sheet a bit here.
You can't keep track of everything every teacher is said you should do and committed to?
No, I can't. That's why we write it down, right? Is that why we put things down type it up, or you write it down? Year 1, well, we learned, try to think of which. Let me find 18, 19 here. I might say the one for that first year, and your question was just to come some examples. Is that what you were asking, Steve? And kind of go back to answer your question.
You tell us what's important for us to hear.
Well, I think some of the big ideas that came out of it were, one was about an after school, how to get kids home after school for our secondary, but Chaparral, 5 miles from both Anthony and Harper. So if a junior high or high school kid doesn't have a vehicle and they have to stay after school to work, how do you get them home? And that became, it's a financial piece, but it's also, we do have buses that transport kids home. So is there a different way we can do our busing route? You have 6 buses, 3 going each way. Does one bus go later to help take home kids that are staying at town? And if so, how there's only usually a smaller number. How crowded does the other bus get? We were going to kind of work through that process. We got into it. And one of the first things in the design workshop is you have your idea, but you really want to go define the problem. The idea was staged out there based on the assumption that this was the problem. But then you go back and really start talking about, well, what is that problem? Is that the actual problem? So you define that first, and we found out that there was more to it than just the transportation. It was the staffing on how to get kids focused and a lot more pieces to it besides just the transportation. And then we also had an idea from our elementary about an after-school program. So at some point in that spring, the email comes from KSDE about the 21st Century After-School Program grant. And so at that point, we're like, well, to do any of this stuff, we do need funding. It does take money and resources to do this. So maybe this makes sense to put these two ideas together to put a grant together. So that's what happened with that one. Those two idea teams came together and put together a grant proposal. And that one was awarded. So those two groups had a strong enough proposal that it was awarded one of the 21st Century After School Program grants. So significant connection there between even having enough energy to put a grant together, let alone get it started, all those good things. So I feel like that idea is, having that grant was very strongly connected to the Innovate K-12 piece. We had one that was called Runner's Relief. And this was one, had a pretty strong idea, but it really never took off when we went through the workshop with it, because it was more one that just needed to get done. And that was just having supplies for kids if they needed hygiene items, whatever it might be, in a way that's not judgmental. You're trying to provide some way for a kid to walk up and grab some stuff and nobody judges. And then that idea came up, that was 18-19. And then last year, that same idea came up again. And our Kiwanis organization had started I don't know if there's any connection with Kiwanis taking this on or not, but they ended up putting an idea in themselves as a service to the community type of project. And they did that. They man that. Kids and some of the adults in the building kind of let them know when supplies get low in certain areas, they come out and restock shelves, that kind of thing. So that idea, we call that aligned. It's already aligned with the project. You don't have to do a workshop for it. You can check it off that it's already going. And so that was one that fit that. Because we worked through certain ideas that are aligned. You figure out where your ideas are at. Sometimes if they're aligned, you say, this one's already going. We don't really need to put a workshop. It's like focus on the workshop with it. We can just make a couple tweaks to it and it already fits in with what we're doing.
Yeah.
So from a strategic standpoint, your goals you're trying to go to, it really helps you hone in on what direction you want to go, because you have to ask yourself that question. Does this fit? Is it aligned or is it not aligned? And what was the other piece that we also tied in our categories from our redesign, like student success skills. We tagged each of our ideas by which ones hit certain of those 4 areas. And that was a way for us to organize those a bit. Part of it is just using the ideas to gather enough information about where our community and staff, like our district, needs to be going. You get a lot of feedback by collecting ideas. You get a lot of feedback about what direction people want to go with things.
Josh, when you said you used the term workshop, what did that look like?
Design workshop. The first year, we scheduled it as 4 2-hour sessions, and we had gone through. We used it's from the IDEO. Is it IDEO from Stanford D School?
Stanford, yeah.
It's kind of IDEO is kind of I think it branches off that. And we had got online and we had first of all had selected, and people could apply to be a part of our design team. And the design team's role was to be the coaches going through the process of design workshop. Now the design workshop, the purpose was, you're going to go through and define your problem, go through the empathy stage to figure out the end user, what's their role going to look like, how might we solve that problem, research, all the way to prototyping and implementation. So that was the design workshop, going through those phases. But our design team, we had 4 teachers that we all worked through. It was an online class. We found a free one through Acumen. And just went through a design workshop class through Acumen together, and we became the design workshop experts, is what we had decided to do with it. And then each person took on a different phase of that workshop. Through the IDEO piece, I think there was like an introduction, and there's some synthesis and problem solving. There's different phases to it, and each person took on a different phase. And that was the first year. This last year, we did it similar. But on the design team, we had 4 ideas, and the 4 design people were to be one of the coaches for that team. to make sure they were helping keeping that group moving forward. So that was kind of ran into a bit of we got most of our workshop done before spring break, so we were okay. But then spring break hits, and I think one of the ideas was flex mod, trying to get, looking at a schedule. And then, spring break hits and COVID, and all of a sudden that some of our stuff has lost a lot of steam, but because of just not seeing each other. But that was kind of our process was that, because we knew, you got to have somebody walking alongside some other teammate to get them through it. The coaching piece, the mentoring piece was a component we wanted to make sure we brought into it. But design workshop, yeah, it's a lot of D school kind of stuff and whatever videos we could find to learn it and go through it that way.
Josh, you talked about that spring break arrived and COVID-19 arrived,
Right.
and there was no more kids coming to school.
Yeah.
How did you weather that storm? How did the work you did on redesign either help or hinder you when kids quit coming to the building?
Well, I think the ability to problem solve and design itself lent itself to just when it came time to pull teachers together in a week's time and organize some thoughts and ideas. I would say it probably just that ability to work through that process was helpful. Just knowing, hey, what's our problem? What's our prototype look like? That was helpful. The kids in the project-based learning academy, that group of kiddos were their system was already they were trained on how to work independently. So when it came time to go, I know some of the stories we heard about some kids took off and they just had all the time in the world to do their projects. They would have project ideas coming in left and right to the advisors on what they wanted to work on. And so some of the kids that really wanted to take off with it, took off with it. Kids that struggle and don't find a connection to it, they probably on the opposite end of it. They probably dropped off more so than they would have been with a teacher there seeing them face to face. So, but the process was there. That process lent itself to get through that a little bit easier.
Josh, it appeared to us that the kids that were most successful working at home, two things. They had learned to be self-directed, like in project-based learning, and they were more engaged. There was something that was really of interest to them.
Yeah.
And again, project-based learning really fit into that. Did you observe the same thing?
Yeah, but with that project-based, and our project-based learning, I should probably explain a little bit what it looks like, but when you say project-based learning, that's got a variety of terms and how people define that.
Yeah.
So, ours is a 7-12 program. Kids would take a class, one subject a day in a 7-period day. One of the classes might be in the PBL Academy. Now, when the kids are in there, though, it's individualized. So there's not a project that the whole class goes through together. The student picks the project, and then we attach learning targets and coach a kid to help them identify their learning targets based on that idea. So it's base the idea, what they want to work on, and then work on the targets that match it. And then you kind of work through the project, presentation, all that kind of good stuff. Yeah. So that it lends itself, the kids that are, one of the toughest challenges about it is what do you want to even work on, right? That's one of the hardest things about the whole program. Once you get a kid that understands what they're interested in and what they want to work on, they can go on their own. We have a continuum. There's a continuum of like 3 different levels. Some kids need lots of coaching, and some can kind of just fly on their own because they know how to do it. So that was, as an advisor, that's one of the very first things you work on is trying to figure out, okay, where is this kid going to land? How much coaching will they need to get through this? But so those kids that are able to go on their own, they had, from a remote learning standpoint, were definitely ready to go with it. But they had learned how to either identify challenges that were interesting to them and learn how to move on it. So that was, now I don't know if I've done a lot of research on the kiddos that are in that spot for us, what their pre-K2 picture looked like, or what their home situation was like, or where they're coming from on those levels. But some kids they just take off with it.
Josh, I remember this was years ago when we were first having these kinds of discussion, and teacher Karen Hull up at Little River asked the kids, what would you like to learn? And finally the kid said, I don't know. Nobody ever asked me before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if you're not asked and you've not practiced
Yeah.
doing that, then it's a pretty new arena. So
Yeah. Yeah.
there is some teaching involved in how to come up with ideas, how to brainstorm, how to brainstorm is what you're doing. How do you brainstorm this thing?
Yeah. Yeah. You know, as a side note, one of the things that we've seen that's very, very effective, that where we've seen middle schools, and, you know, we have an agreement with Boy Scouts of America, and they've got 135 badges. Middle schools that let kids just kind of start choosing a badge to work on, and those are really good projects. It seems to be a way to get the kid into that arena,
Right.
and you give them a list of 135, something on that list is of interest.
Yeah.
And so you have a starting point. Well, what did you find interesting in that? You know, and once you get a kid into that first project, they're much more likely to think of the second one.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
I want to show you a slide, and this kind of summarizes, you know, these are the three areas that we're looking at: the 5 state goals, the definition of a successful Kansan, and the redesign principles. And those that are in the aqua, we got that in a report. We will next year. The purple, those are quantitative data. We got that this year. And then the redesign principles. When you look at these things, which of these areas did you pay closest attention to when you were talking about redesign? Did you look at all 3 of these big categories? Did you kind of zoom in on something? How did you guys approach it at Chaparral?
I think the graduation rate post-secondary attainment was the focus, because those go together for that effective rate. So those 2 became the main target. Academic skills really wasn't as much on the radar. I think partly, we got somewhat of the direction or sense that graduation rate post-secondary was kind of focus, and academic state assessment. Is that what you mean? Academic skills, would that be your assessment, Kansas assessment? Yeah. Became somewhat secondary, and now it's shifted gears again. But I would say graduation rate post-secondary. So a lot of the ideas were the 3 choices at the high school level were to help kids stay engaged in school as they graduate.
Yeah.
The idea with our transition to career, which is the program with Attica to try to get kids in job shadowing, and everything was all related to post-secondary. So those 2 were a biggie.
Josh, that prompts a question, you know, with your academy, and it's a automotive academy. Is academy the right term?
Somewhat tricky because we have a PBL academy, so I don't want to that's a separate piece. So the one in Attica is through Pratt Junior College and Pratt Community College, and it's like South Central pathway, something to that effect. So
yeah, and that's a great program, but it appears that our small districts, you use a lot of energy on that one program, and you know, we talk all the time with KSDE with the CTE team. It's really hard. You know, Wichita can have that kind of energy applied to every program because they've got so many people and resources. That's really hard in a small district to have multiple of those. And yet, you know, we have kids interested in all kinds of things. I guess my question is, as a superintendent in a relatively small district, what do you try to do to make sure every kid is getting their future plans met?
When you listen to kids, you try to put together the list of things that have the most numbers. I talk about, it's a numbers game. You've got to have certain numbers for it to make sense. So we look at that's one factor, one angle. I mentioned Attica. I don't want to. So our automotive program is also connected to Medicine Lodge.
Yeah.
So yeah, we have kids that come from medicine. So we knew we had, in order for this to work, we needed to combine with some other high schools.
Yeah.
And so Medicine Lodge is part of that, along with Attica. So that, I think those, what other districts can we bring in? And it's kind of a grand total. You start looking at the total population of kids, you try to hit a certain number. whatever that number, above 1,000. If you can get enough high schools together to get above a certain threshold, then all of a sudden your opportunities and ability to take care of kids changes quite a bit.
Yeah.
Even for us, it'd be 500. That would be what we're trying to get to.
Yeah, it's, and then I hope that I didn't imply that you needed to have the answer, because we're struggling with it across the state. We have our small schools, really small schools, will have a career pathway, and on a given year, not one kid's interested in that pathway.
Yeah.
Because of the numbers. It's a numbers game.
Yeah. No, we've talked about you can add as many pathways as possible to your schedule, but it all depends on the kids in the classes. Still depend on your FTE and your buildings. And so your pathways do ebb and flow a bit every year, depending on where student interests are and strengths of kids. So that does change. I think the online atmosphere of it will help. We've had quite a few kids go through WSU Tech, as well as Pratt Community College with some things. So as that model changes on virtual learning with that, especially that freshman, sophomore after high school, that that 13th, 14th grade, those programs help out quite a bit. We are looking at a welding program in our community, and welding has always been it's manufacturing. It's a top priority, but we've always had welding programs in our high schools, but never one that's really a certification-based kind of welding program.
Yeah.
So taking that leap this year with a certification-based program as well. So we'll have automotive and a welding with Medicine Lodge, Chaparral, and Attican. Well, part of that welding program though is just virtual welding. It's a software that you can buy, and along with all the other gadgetry to help teach welding without using up welding rod and the safety factors, all that kind of good thing. So I think as those type of devices get developed and are not as expensive, because the device we were looking to purchase was $30,000. So that is not something you can just roll out and we want 5 of those. No, that's one of those things when you make that decision, you want to make sure it's going to get used, and you don't want it to expire in 3 years either. It's one of those things where technology replaces it in 3 years. It's probably not the best thing. So we're still looking at it just because it could help us. But anyway, you get to the point where there's virtual things like that helps you with teaching, because you don't need to have a person on site to travel around. So
we're a lot more wide open to that discussion now, aren't we? After the last 9 weeks.
Yeah. And that has changed things too, just how we approach learning with what's happened. So
do you monitor the paper every day on whether or not we're going to reopen, or we're going to be virtual, or we're going to have the second wave? Or are you like all other superintendents?
I have watched it, but I don't know if I think I focus more on getting our resources in place and teams in place to be able to move when we're ready.
Yeah.
And it reminds me of just that team of you want to be flexible. So, but you've got to have your communication protocol in place, all your teams in place when the time comes. They're ready to go. Little design practice here, there, just to be able to design around a given, just because you want to be able to adjust. We know I feel like in our community here, we're small enough and rural enough where we haven't had a ton of cases. Yet, once we do, that will definitely impact the direction we go with things. So that could happen. What if it happens school for us starts August 19th. What if it happens the week, we're looking at that and it happens August 10th.
Yeah.
Or it happens August 19th. We better be ready to adjust and make sure we take care of people. So I think we'll have some options in place. We'll have plan A, B, and C kind of thing. I don't know how deep I'll go into plan options, but that's that. But still, listen, there's conversations around the state going on for sure around what districts are planning and why and those kind of things. So I'm attuned to it, but haven't done a lot of work with what ours looks like in detail yet.
The good news is whatever you hear this week, it'll change next week.
It changes, doesn't it? Yep.
Hey, are you how deeply engaged are you with the conversation about moving from standards to competencies?
It's one of our elementary principals for sure looking at it. We've made it a K-12 strategic conversation, especially knowing from KSDE the work that's being done on that. We've I have bits and pieces of people on the committee, but don't have a ton of energy around what it's going to look like. But here's the other benefit for us right now. Well, this kind of ties back to our Innovate K-12, but we applied for a school climate grant last summer, and it allowed us to hire staff and do really was a focus on MTSS behavior. That's what it boiled down to. So school climate connected to MTSS behavior or any kind of MTSS. So the grant was awarded in October, when you're notified in October. So if your staffing numbers are based on hiring in October, we weren't able to hire people till January. So we had 3 months of grant money that we didn't use. So we're shifting some of that use towards summer help or just having teachers come in and work over the summer.
Uh-huh.
Now, so part of that is going to be connected to competencies and how kind of even our definition of learning and assessments. And we're kind of working through what that process needs to look like currently, because we want to make sure if we have conversations around this, we want to make sure it's used and it needs to be impactful to what we're working on. So, and we've also gone through MTSS structuring last year for behavior with an MTSS team. So that's kind of taken up our redesign work a bit, just that focus, because that's been an interesting conversation as well, going through the TASN work with MTSS, and then how does that fit redesign? And the question comes up quite often, why do we have a TASN team and an MTSS team, or a redesign team and a KISA team, trying to get these all under one name, learning quite a bit about how those are all put together at Topeka. There's a lot of pieces to that. And so that just takes time, right? It just takes some time to work through it. So we've shifted, working on a lot of expectation, clarity on processes and systems. So I think this year's been a lot of systems kind of things. Still have innovation going on, but systems has become a focus for sure. So we are hoping to use some of our time to talk about competencies. So what does that look like? A lot of conversations. We've even, because Wichita's gone to standard reference grading. So we're, kind of using that model as well. Difference between standards-based grading, standards reference grading, competency-based learning, what's the similarity differences in all these terms, and trying to come up with which one do we land on and which direction do we go exactly.
Yeah. Well, Josh, put a bow around this for us. Any last comments, or, when you look back over your redesign experience, tell us what's on your mind.
I think I guess I go back to it. This is probably more of a rural education vision or value, whatever it might be. But I strongly believe that in order for rural communities or any urban anywhere really to be successful, you've got to be innovative. You've got to learn how to change things when it's time to change, and know when it's time to change. So I would say that's one thing we've tried as a personal leader, have tried to emphasize. There's always multiple ways to do things, but I think we got to come together on it, but it's also got to be done in a way that flexes around the situation that we're in. So innovation to me means that our ability to flex, and kind of goes back to trying to think where I came up with this speed of change, right? We're working on our ability to innovate. It all depends on our ability to quickly change. What is our speed of change? Are we in pretty good shape, or are we out of shape when it comes to change? So I think of innovation as a way to practice those skills that help you change.
Yeah.
So I think that's my kind of the bow, or why I do what I do with the whole thing.
Yeah. Well, Josh, thank you. This is very interesting. It seems like all of our guests are doing something unique, and the way you guys are approaching collecting ideas and involving everybody is really unique, and I can't wait to monitor it and see where you go.
No, thanks for having me. It's been fun. Good stuff.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you, everybody, for joining this session of Inside Redesign. We hope to see you in July, and we will look forward to our next guest. So see you in July. Thank you, Josh. Appreciate it, and appreciate everything you're doing.
Thank
Good,
you.
great
Thank
stuff.
Thanks, Josh.